All right, folks. I'm Mike, and I'm going to talk about co-founding a startup focused in open source and all the trials and tribulations. By a quick sort of show of hands, how many here currently work at what they would consider a startup? All right. Oh, a couple of folks. How many are maybe interested in looking at creating a startup? Okay, decent amount of you. All right. Let's get into it. It's an interesting era for that, and yeah. So quick disclaimer, I will be talking a little bit about what Kusari does as a product, but this is in no way a vendor pitch. If you have deep questions about what we do, you could go visit our booth. And in addition to that, I'm mostly an engineer. I'm not a slidesmith. I'm much better at giving technical demos, so I apologize. I don't have all the fancy sort of infographics and all that good stuff. Okay, so who am I today? I'm CTO and co-founder of Kusari. We do software supply chain security. In the CNCF, I'm a tag security and compliance tech lead for folks who are familiar with sort of the technical advisory groups. I'm an OpenSSF governing board member. So OpenSSF is the Open Source Security Foundation. They're sort of a sister foundation to the CNCF. CNCF is very much focused on the cloud, Kubernetes, those sorts of things. OpenSSF is very much focused on software security, particularly securing open source and using open source to secure software. In addition to that, I'm also an OpenSSF Technical Advisory Council member. So that's sort of the folks similar to the TOC, the Technical Operating Committee here, Technical Oversight Committee here in CNCF. And I also maintain various open source projects, including Guac and Salsa. And we'll talk about those in a second. So how did I get to where I am today? I don't usually like talking about myself, but somewhere in the early 90s, I somehow got introduced to Python, a very early version of Python. And that's kind of how I first discovered that, hey, downloading Python was actually free, and I was not somehow stealing something from somebody. I went to college, didn't do particularly well, but I still sort of graduated. Early on in my career, I was working at managed services providers, so doing a lot of what's referred to as system administration, eventually kind of broke into what is now known as DevOps, DevSecOps, SRE. A little over 10 years ago, I ended up working at a hedge fund out in Connecticut called Bridgewater Associates. And that's kind of where I got very much focused in security, also where I got more introduced to open source, which is, again, is a bit of a surprise. You normally think big hedge fund, super private and that sort of thing. And yes, with a lot of their stuff they were, but not so much with their sort of integration with technology. And then ended up at some large banks where I found myself miserable, and then co-founded Kusari. So let me talk a little bit about how sort of, pre-founding Kusari, how I got involved, not just in using open source, not just in occasionally opening up an issue with open source, but how I kind of got involved more broadly in the actual community. So in 2019, I was working at a bank called MUFG. Over there, I was introduced to the CNCF Financial Services User Group. Again, big bank. Usually pretty private about these things, but they recognize the importance of open source. The CTO there was very much focused on how can we be more involved in open source, because if we're looking at things like Kubernetes, hey, we can't just keep all of our problems to ourselves, because most likely other people have similar issues. We should all be talking with each other. In 2020, I became co-chair of that group. And that's when also I participated in the first, it was a virtual KubeCon at the time because of the pandemic. And I gave participated in, I think it was a tangential podcast, but that was put on by the CNCF. Talked a lot about, how we were doing things there. Again, as an end user, super important. In 2021, I was introduced to OpenSSF. I joined the SALSA group early on. So for folks who are not super familiar, SALSA is a sort of a build framework for how to secure your build so that you get provenance. It now does more than just the build, includes source and some other things as well. And I became part of that original steering committee. So in this particular case, Google donated SALSA to the OpenSSF, and they wanted more folks to kind of become part of that. I was very familiar with build security from my time, both in the banks and at the hedge fund, where I did a whole bunch of work with things like Jenkins and things like Tecton and those sorts of things. I contributed to the Software Supply Chain Security Best Practices Guide, which was my first sort of participation in tag security. Eventually, as part of my work there, I became a tech lead for tag security. Tag security is now known as Tag Security and Compliance. I co-led the writing of the CNCF Secure Software Reference Factory. And then as part of that, when I was at Citi, we worked to create a thing called Fresca, which I'll talk about in a second here. And then in 2022, we contributed Fresca to the OpenSSF. Just a quick point on my co-founders here. So here's Tim. He's the CEO. He's also here today. He mostly worked in fintech, finserv. In his previous life, he was in fact a software engineer, for as much as he maybe forgets it sometimes. And he actually did contribute a bunch to Helm kind of early on. Parth is my other co-founder. He mostly worked in sort of the government space, and he also maintains and contributes to multiple projects, including OpenSSF Guac there. Okay, so why make Kusari? Well, one of the things is we're very much involved in software supply chain security, and that's not going away, right? Third-party risk management, it's important, you know. We were considered experts in the space, so again, given that we were doing a lot of work early on in open source, contributing to these white papers and whatever, we got folks reaching out to us, asking us like, hey, you're doing a whole lot of really cool stuff here in CNCF and OpenSSF. Have you thought about making a business? Now, again, the VC firms were pinging us a lot about this and saying, hey, are you interested in making a company? In hindsight, that was probably a terrible reason, right, to kind of go after that. Just because somebody wants you to make a company doesn't mean you should. Now, again, that wasn't the primary reason, but it definitely helped sort of maybe push us over the line. We were burnt out from working at large companies. There's nothing worse than constantly just spending all day opening tickets and making tickets and not, actually sitting down and writing code. And in addition to that, we weren't getting any younger. And so why focus on open source, especially sort of in our space of supply chain security? Well, 96% of all code projects rely on open source. Including, if it's a closed source project, it somehow relies on open source, so there's, problems there. And then 77% of all code potentially originates from open source. And so that means you really can't fix the software supply chain, right, which is dependencies and dependencies of dependencies, if you're not working in open source, because if the majority of the problem's in open source, you can't fix that holistically in a closed source way. You have to work with the community. So introducing Fresca. So that was the first project we had sort of built when we were originally at Citi. It got contributed. We sort of spun off as a company, and we were sort of looking at maybe building a product on top of that. So Fresca stands for the Factory for Repeatable Secure Creation of Artifacts. It's just a backronym. It's an example implementation of the CNCF's Secure Software Factory Reference Architecture. So again, that paper from the CNCF, it was a way, again, to collaborate in open source. It's a bunch of infrastructure and code and configuration as code that deploys and configures a secure CI/CD system. And it does a lot of things, like it helps out with SBOMs and SALSA attestations, and it has a whole policy framework for allowing you to sort of define how your builds, like different security properties for your build, different constraints, like should this build have network access, not have network access, all that good stuff. It wraps and uses multiple open source projects that we ourselves have sort of contributed to as well. So like Kubernetes, Tecton Chains, SALSA, Spiffy Spire, and the list kind of goes on. This is just kind of a brief look at that sort of architecture. I'm not going to go super deep into it because, again, this is mostly just about sort of our journey here in open source. But we had some early hiccups with Fresca, right? So one was, hey, it's open source, and it's hard to run an open source project when all it is just config as code, infrastructure as code. Most folks, what they're really looking for is, hey, where's that cool, software project I can work on? Where's that cool Rust or Go project I can work on? And then also, in addition to that, given that a lot of this stuff being infrastructure as code and config as code, it's glue code, right? It's stuff to make sure things will work together, and it's really not considered particularly cool. So a lot of folks often don't want to contribute to the project. And then as a product, to be perfectly frank, a lot of folks are like, I'm not moving off of my Jenkins. I have my Jenkins. I've had it for the past decade. You have to provide me a really, really good reason to move off of it. So a lot of folks were not looking to move off of their Jenkins, or if they had, they were already looking at things like GitHub. In addition to that, a lot of folks, even though, hey, the build was super important to them, it wasn't solving the big problem. They just didn't know what was actually even happening in their software supply chain. In addition to that, we also had a problem of people were building their own products that were based on Fresca, but they actually weren't contributing back to the project. So that's one of the issues with that. So with that said, I think just want to kind of state, it is OK to sunset a project. Don't just keep it limping along for the sake of it. It's OK, just be explicit. So again, by that I mean communication is kind of key here. You want to communicate with your users and stakeholders, folks like the TOC for CNCF, OpenSSF, your TAC, your users, so on. Make sure that they're aware, hey, look, this is in maintenance mode. We're planning to archive it. We might be pulling back for a few months. Because again, when it comes to sort of open source, your reputation in open source is really, really important, and you don't want to burn folks. And again, it's OK that not everything ends up working, right? That's kind of the cool thing about open source is, hey, you can kind of, do cool stuff. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. But you get that feedback quickly, right? Which is nice. One of the things that's really great for us is we didn't build all of this privately and then go out to the community and say, hey, great, we built this awesome build system. And everybody said, why would you do that? We don't want it. Whereas here, hey, we spent a little bit of time building it in open source, and it just wasn't working. And again, I think that it kind of goes without saying, don't just go and rug pull, and don't just go and do something else that's sort of anti-open source, change the license, only release particular sponsored versions or whatever. So then that led us to sort of look at GWAC. So GWAC it's another backronym, stands for the Graph for Understanding Artifact Composition. Focused on understanding your supply chain. So this is stuff like Salsa in Toto licenses, and then very importantly for folks who are familiar, software bill of materials, so like SBOMs, SBOMs, SBOMs. It's really about sort of giving an understanding of that. And so this is kind of the just general open source pitch here of GWAC. So GWAC takes in all sorts of metadata like software bill of materials, information from open source databases like deps.dev, things like in Toto attestations, VEX documents, information from OpenSSF scorecard, clearly defined license information, vulnerability information from OSV, all sorts of stuff, pulls it all in and generates a graph out of it. And at a slightly deeper level, this is kind of what it looks like, where, hey, you have all of these different SBOMs, we pull it in, we turn it into a giant graph, and then, where you can kind of connect where, hey, if you have multiple SBOMs that all cite the same dependency, you get all sorts of great information, and you can tie it to understand not just one project, but multiple projects, multiple products you might have at your organization, help you understand what might be going on there. So what are some of the hiccups with GWAC, right? What were some of the issues that we sort of ran into in the open source community? One was the scope was very, very broad, right? We were saying, hey, we can help answer any supply chain question. Well, by doing that, we kind of had to create very, very complex, complicated software. Another thing, and this is more of just a pure technical thing, hey, GraphQL is hard. We were using GraphQL as a way to sort of query our system. It was also not being used outside, in the normal GraphQL use case. We were using it more of like an actual query language, where even though technically the Q in GraphQL is query, it's not really. It's something else. Another challenge for us as a business is, even though, so we co-created this project with Google, like we contributed just as much code, if not a little bit more, than Google early on. Even though we did that, when we sort of started it in the open source, Google got a lot of that early PR, right? We didn't get as much of that PR because, again, we were a small startup. So that was we had some issues initially there. There was initially a ton of interest, but it tapered off quickly. And there's lots of different reasons for that. A lot of it had to do with a lot of our end users who were using us. A lot of those groups, those OSPOs, don't exist anymore. They all got laid off. A lot of the folks who were contributing to the project had gotten laid off or had been reorganized to work on different projects, not so much software supply chain security anymore. A good example here is, hey, a lot of that software supply chain security stuff ended up going to AI and things like that. So that was a challenge. It's also a full-fledged system with that requires a lot of components. This is not something that is super simple to spin up. It's, think of it less as like, it's more like full-fledged Kubernetes as opposed to Minikube. So in addition to that, we also had a couple of cases where people privately forked Guac. They were either using it internally at their end users. I'm not going to call out any specific folks, but there are some massive multi-trillion-dollar companies that had built out POCs internally with Guac. They never showed up to a single meeting. They never contributed a single line of code. And in addition to that, we also had a few folks fork Guac and start to try to build products on it. So Guac, still today, hey, it's successful. It's an OpenSSF incubating project. It's post 1.0. Red Hat has contributed Trustify to it. So it's now Trustify is part of the Guac project. So Trustify was originally based on Guac, and then they went in a slightly different direction. But we realized actually our communities worked better together than apart, so we merged. Guac is used by CNCF themselves for some of their licensing auditing. It's used by various end user companies for internal sort of supply chain stuff. And it's cited in also a bunch of stuff, including some recent AI security related guidance. So if we were to do it all over again, how would I create a project in open source? One is, hey, make it a CLI tool, don't make it a daemon, make it something super simple to use, don't require a bunch of services to run, make something super simple when you're starting off. Focus more on the simple use cases, because again, the enterprise use cases, they're willing to pay for it, right? And then in addition to that, if I have a simple use case, I'm not looking to run an enterprise open source thing. So some advice on building your product versus your open source project. If there's one piece of advice I can give and that you take away from this is your open source project is not your product, right? Don't give away your product. Single player mode versus multiplayer mode. So open source focused on, focus on smaller scale things like focus on developers, small teams. Your product, hey, it's fine to have your product focused on enterprises, on industry-specific things. Like, hey, your open source is probably always going to be relatively generic. Hey, we're doing workflow automation or whatever. Oh, you want to do workflow automation for medical devices. Great, that's kind of more focused. That should be where your product is more focused on. In addition to that, people buy expertise, right? The reason why people are reaching out to you is because you're the expert on a thing. So that's where they're coming to you for, not just because you have your open source project. And then in addition to that, there's some common things like people buy enterprise features, so SSO, SAML, Federation, that kind of stuff. You don't necessarily, need to have that directly integrated into your open source project. Especially since, again, if a company is going to go do it on their own, they're most likely going to want to build their own integrations into their own workflows. So just to kind of give you a little background here, a little bit about what our product is and how it compares to open source, right? Our product here is a platform for understanding third-party risk, vendor and open source stuff, right? It tracks SBOM and other supply chain metadata, very much like Guac. But the thing about it, right, is our customers can tailor the analysis to their specific risk profiles, unlike Guac. It doesn't really look like our open source very much. It's very much built on top of our open source, but it doesn't actually look like it very much. And again, going back to the glue code from several slides ago, hey, glue code isn't cool, but the glue code is often the key parts that make your product your product, right? So all of those great features around entitlements and all that good stuff. And then also all of this stuff that we've built in open source, it allows us to ingest all this data, which we can then sell back to customers for various reasons. So here's an example of our open source front end, which again, this is sort of just a a blown up thing of Guac, and it's a graph. And even though it kind of looks cool, it's this is clearly a front end that is made by back end engineers like myself. This is not something that is necessarily super easy to use, and it's kind of a cool little thing, but it's not necessarily people are not going to be using this on the day-to-day to help solve their business challenges. And so again, this is just a very quick, just to show a comparison. This is kind of what we sell to people, right? Like dashboards and those sorts of things, which is what folks want, which again is usually not what open source developers want to work on. They want to work on interesting graph-related visualizations. They don't want to work on necessarily things like this. So to kind of go back to that, right? Hey, our very cool open source visualizer isn't very useful. It's cool. It catches people's attention in open source, especially. It doesn't solve the business problem, but we needed to build something else, right? And then some other things when it comes to some of this is, hey, even if open source was not viable as a product, we saw hyperscalers in our community meetings taking notes, right? If they want to run it as a SaaS, they can do it cheaper. So we very quickly were like, hey, if we could sell, just purely sell Guac, the cloud providers could sell it cheaper than we could. And again, if folks do want to work on a cool open source visualizer, please come chat with us in the OpenSSF Slack. So Kusari is sort of open source focused tech. Again, we use tech and code from Guac, but not Guac itself. So a lot of the libraries that that are open source, they power our actual tool. And then we also leverage open source tools in CNCF, OpenSSF, and elsewhere that most of which we contribute to in some capacity. So this is stuff like Scorecard, the OSV schema, SPDX, CycloneDX, OpenVex, Protobomb, Kubernetes, Ismore, Vue, and the list kind of goes on. So very much, even though we weren't using this particular one, we're very much focused in open source. Open source also drives our business. So open source is often at the cutting edge. End users don't have the capabilities to adopt, implement, and customize open source to their needs. We understand that. We understand how to do that. Open source gives us connections, right? Some CNCF OpenSSF members are our partners, customers, and we would not have met them had we not been participating in open source. Your open source reputation is a billboard, right? People can see you're the smartest people in the room because it's out in the open, right? You are in the meetings along with folks from massive enterprises, and you're talking with them, you're building stuff with them. You are there, people see you. And then even when large companies pull back from open source, that's a useful indicator for you and your business to understand, hey, is that something I should go after? Maybe it is a market niche that is no longer being looked at, or maybe it's something that, hey, it's an indicator that you should also maybe not do that anymore because they've done the hard work for you. So another thing here, importance of community, not just code. So to reiterate, community can become your customers. Build partnerships with foundations. OpenSSF and CNCF and the LF wants to work with startups. They want to work with folks and help them out. Don't just contribute to your own projects, right? A lot of the reason why people talk to us is because, hey, I didn't start Salsa, but I contributed to Salsa, and now I'm a steering committee member, and I'm a maintainer of Salsa. And then the other thing that I think a lot of folks forget is like chop wood, carry water, right? Help take notes, help run the meetings, coordinate, write documentation. I have probably said, hey, just as a reminder, this meeting's being recorded, it'll be uploaded to LFX thousands of times in my life, right? That sort of stuff is still needed, and people remember it as much as, you might not think so. Community is also an equalizer here. I'm a member of the OpenSSF governing board. I would not have been voted in as a member of the governing board if I was not doing the work, right? Because here I am in a governing board with executives at massive enterprises, but, and then me, right? Like, so that is something that, would not have happened in any other community other than something like open source. I'm also an open source, I'm also on the OpenSSF Technical Advisory Council, where it's the same sort of thing. Your contributions are valued just as important as those from massive enterprises, right? These contributions are recognized. Massive enterprises can bring the dollars, but you can bring the expertise, you can bring the cycles. Because again, if you have a startup, you might not have a lot of money, but you know that you have the time and this is where you're focused, and that's where you can kind of spend a lot there. So takeaways here for open source: get involved. You won't get recognized if you don't show up. Contribute back. Again, not even if you don't contribute directly to a project that helps your business. Contributing generally to open source helps bring good karma. I know that's helped us out a lot. Like, I contribute a lot to docs that ended up like, actually, we ended up going in a completely different direction, right? But it helped out a lot of folks, and sometimes they're just like, hey, I really like that thing you used to work on. We should still have a chat. I saw you're doing a thing in security now. Oh, awesome, right? Startups can punch above their weight class, as they say, right? Like, I keynoted at KubeCon earlier this year, right? In KubeCon London, and I would not have been able to get that opportunity if I was not contributing to open source, right? That was because I was contributing to OpenSSF, and I had gotten a slot there. Don't rely on the community to contribute to things you want. They're fickle. Put yourselves in the shoes of the community. Hey, everybody now cares about AI. They don't care about security. Cool. Everybody's, who's working in open source is going to start working on some AI project. But also, work with larger organizations to understand their needs and, see how you might be able to help each other out. Right? There's a lot of large organizations, many of them premier members, platinum members, diamond sponsors here, who are folks we regularly are chatting with and working with and building partnerships with, and some of them are even our customers now. And then finally here, again, some takeaways as a startup: don't open source just purely your product. Also, another thing is you are not a hyperscaler. Just running your open source as a SaaS is not going to be enough. The cloud providers can do it cheaper and better than you can. Don't be like some of the folks where you see that they're like, hey, all my business is being taken by one of these cloud companies, and it's because, hey, what you're selling is essentially just purely a basic, your open source daemon, and they can just run it. And people are coming to you because you're the experts, not just because you can run this in the cloud. And then in addition to that, it's moral to crash the parties of those bigger than you. I have very much crashed multiple parties of multiple large organizations because I have discovered that they are, they've been using my project but not contributing back. At the very least, they can, feed me and I can get some free drinks off of them.
Hell yeah.
And then also, don't rely on the community to build your product, right? It is very much your responsibility to build it. And there, so that's it for me. If you want to keep in touch, my website is mikeneeds.rest. And then there's Kusari's open source projects. And then here's a bunch of projects that we contribute to ourselves. Yep. And there's no time for questions, but I will be just around if folks want to chat.